One of the things that's really exciting about working with Extinction Rebellion and the legal strategy team is we have an amazing range of people from different, with different hats and backgrounds. Tim from Plan B is a key member of that team. And I'd like to invite Tim to come up now and give us a bit of an overview of the strategy.
Thank you all for being here and also for being prepared to take such an important stand on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the planet. Just tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a barrister. My background is actually criminal law, human rights law. At one point I had this very naive idea you could change things by working on the inside, and I was head of legal for the National Criminal Intelligence Service, before working out that actually you're never going to change things, some aspects of the system, and before working out that actually by far the most serious crime that's going on, the most serious crime against humanity, the most fundamental breach of anybody's rights here is the destruction of the planet. And to be part of a criminal law agency that isn't addressing that is somewhat missing the point. So Plan B is a charity that now focuses on legal action to deal with people who are blocking progress around climate change or part of the problem. We're taking action against the government for failing to align its carbon targets to the Paris Agreement. We've got an action against the government for its completely insane proposals to expand Heathrow, because we all know what we need is less emissions and not more emissions. I'd just like to set a little bit of context about how important the criminal justice process is to the overall XR legal strategy. It's a big thing for anyone to decide they're going to break the law, that they're going to get arrested. It can have consequences for you, for your family, but clearly not on the scale of the consequences of doing nothing. That's what's motivating all of us. And I'd just like to take an analogy. Imagine we're on board a ship together, and it suddenly becomes clear the ship is sailing into the rocks, and we start to talk amongst ourselves and go, look, this doesn't look right. Seems to be heading straight into the, what's going on? And we start to talk to the staff, and they say, yeah, this seems a bit strange. We'll talk to the captain. I'm sure everything is okay. But nothing changes. We keep sailing towards the rocks, and we're getting closer and closer, and you start to sense the panic. And it becomes obvious that something is wrong. We don't know exactly what's wrong. We don't know whether the captain is drunk, whether he's crazy, whether he's been taken over by some, other forces, whatever it is. We just can see the rocks right in front of us. Now, there might be ordinary conditions of passage, ordinary conditions about travelling on that boat. We're not meant to go into the captain's area. We're not meant to break the windows. But there comes a point when it would be absurd to keep obeying those rules. There comes a point when just to be a human being, to be a decent person with a conscience, you're going to take action not just for yourselves, but for your fellow passengers. Now imagine you break the windows to help people escape. You break down the door to the captain's cabin, whatever it is. I mean, can anybody imagine being prosecuted? You're a hero. I mean, well, yes, but how absurd that would be. And this is really a perfect analogy for the situation we're all in now. It may be a little bit harder to see the rocks, but actually the information that we're heading towards the rocks is completely clear, and we're doing it at a frightening pace. And it's my belief that if we're able to persuade a court that that is precisely the situation we're in, and we actually get them to understand that really, truly, fully, well then how are they going to find you guilty? You can see there are various sort of pitfalls along the way where they might say, well, you might think we're heading towards the rocks. It's just, that's just your view. No, it's not. It's everybody's. It's every scientist, everyone who actually studies this. If we live in a society which is based on knowledge, based in a belief in science, based in a belief in our collective powers to understand the world around us, sorry, this isn't an argument anymore. It's completely clear. The rocks are there. We're speeding up towards them. And that we can show the court. I mean, we've got all the evidence. Might be, not the easiest thing for, you as an individual to do it, but with help, you can show them. And we know that one of the problems we have at the moment is the complete abdication of responsibility by the government to give people accurate information about this. What we know we've had for decades is campaigns of misinformation by the fossil fuel industry. These are very well documented. While they were building their oil rigs higher in the ocean, because their own research was telling them about sea level rise from climate change, simultaneously they were pouring millions and millions of dollars into bogus think tanks, the Heartland Institute, to tell us all there was nothing to worry about. That's what's been happening. And governments have, one foot with, they're in bed with vested interests a lot of the time. We've actually had the Energy Minister, Claire Perry, say, look, it's not government's job to tell people what's happening. They can work it out for themselves. Great. And so a lot of people who don't think about this, they just don't know. Magistrates, judges, jurors, they don't have good information either. A lot of the time. People are busy, and it's hard to go through some of the science. But if you or somebody in court takes them on a journey, takes them to the truth of this, that's going to be quite shocking for them too. The other problem you can imagine we might encounter in court is a judge, jurors, magistrates saying, okay, we understand there's a problem, but just tell us how blocking the roads helps to solve it. Tell us why the things that you've done, have anything to do with the solution. Well, I think it's clear. I mean, since Extinction Rebellion started, there's been a real change in the dialogue. There's been a real change in the media. One of the most striking things for me was seeing in the Times, in the Murdoch press, which has been one of the worst sources of misinformation on climate change, Matt Ridley, all this denial. There was an article in November in the Times saying, and we got in touch with the London School of Economics. We spoke to Professor Sam Fankhauser there, who confirmed that although Extinction Rebellion's claims might sound apocalyptic, actually they're very reasonable, they're pretty true, and calls to tell the truth are welcome. And you can, I looked at some of the comments under that. Times readers was going, what's going on? Have you gone, you've lost the plot of the Times. This is the first time they're being exposed to the truth of this. It's amazing. It's getting people talking. It's getting people thinking. Last month we had the Mayor of London declaring a climate emergency. It's not unrelated. Forcing people to think. And this actually is the only solution. We have to change the culture. Because if you don't change the culture, the politicians aren't going to change. They listen to the people around them. They want to be voted in. The only thing that can change this is this, overwhelming demand. This is crazy to keep steering the boat towards the rocks. So this collective action really is truly the only solution. It's the only way things are going to change. So what I don't want to do, I don't think anybody should do, is stand in front of you and say, this is going to be easy, come along, get arrested, go through the courts. That's not fair, that's not right, that's not responsible. It's, this is a big decision for everybody personally. But the point is, if you do choose to do that, and you have your reasons for doing that, there is a really powerful argument that can be made in court. And if we do have hundreds of people making that argument, making it again and again and again, well, those judges, those magistrates are going to keep hearing it. The public's going to keep hearing it. The media's going to keep hearing it. And that can be incredibly powerful. So there's method in this. And it can work. Just over 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, some climate change activists, some of you will know about this, climbed up the chimney stack of a coal-fired power station, Kings North, and graffitied Gordon all over it, and were charged with criminal damage. They were acquitted on the basis they were trying to prevent the greater harm. And that was in 2008. And things have got worse then. In fact, Gordon Brown was Gordon Brown, but still, in 2008, the government were relatively quite active on climate change. They'd introduced the first ever Climate Change Act. Everybody knows that the situation is far, far worse now in 2019 in terms of what's going on in the climate, and we've got a government that's, just putting its foot on the clutch, speeding towards these rocks with fracking, with aviation, with fossil fuel subsidies. It's mad. So if you could persuade a jury in 2008 that painting Gordon on a chimney stack was actually helping to address climate change, I think it can be done now. Not saying it's going to be easy. Courts don't like the idea of people taking the law into their own hands. You can imagine the thing that they will want to say, well, where would we be if everybody thought they could break the law just because they were right? That's what you're working with. You have to say it's more than that. This isn't just, I think, I've got a point here. That this is the reality and everybody's entitled to be aware of it. This is the overall context. I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about this later on if there's time. Today is really about Mission LifeForce. This is a really important resource. It's based on Article 9 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to freedom of conscience. It's not in itself a defence. You can't say, I committed criminal damage because of my freedom of conscience. That doesn't get you off. But talking about your beliefs, why you feel you have to do what you do, that can engage Article 9. That can help persuade the court to listen to you, to listen to your arguments. In the event you're found guilty, it can be relevant to sentence. The courts have said, we kind of got a deal here. If we know people are acting out of conscience, really, then they should get off pretty lightly in the end. That's not really, we're not dealing with people who are profoundly a threat. We're dealing with people who are standing up for their beliefs. That's very relevant to sentence. So that's the context, I think, for hearing a bit more from Jojo, and it's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it myself. So, time to hand over.
Thank you very much, Tim. One of the things that this particular approach, which is the conscientious protector approach, does, is we know from experience that actually it is absolutely, of course, about people's beliefs and people standing in those beliefs. But what we've found that in the course of the procedure of a criminal trial, it actually is extremely effective in opening up the court to hear those things that, as Tim was saying, they absolutely need to hear. And so that's one of its key strengths. I would like to begin with give a very brief overview of what Mission LifeForce is all about, so that you can kind of see the bigger picture of what we're working on and how this all fits in. So this approaching crash into the rocks, if you like, as we also do know, it is preventable. And we do know that the kinds of ecocides that are happening across the world, everything from deforestation to tar sands to fracking, which is what got me out of my armchair 5 years ago and into this whole arena, these things are all preventable. They carry on because they are permitted. It's not against the law to cut down the rainforests. It's allowed. That's why it happens.
Cut down what?
The rainforest, for example. So, if we start from some of the basic, really most basic rights we've got, the right to life, which is the most basic right of all, that right on its own doesn't have the power for you to maintain it. In other words, the reason that a right to life, what protects your right to life, if you like, is the fact that if someone takes your life, they're committing a crime. Okay, so in an equivalent discourse, rights of nature is a very big discourse internationally at the moment, and making sure that the earth, that non-human species are given rights, that the landscape itself is given rights, and so on. This is all wonderful, and absolutely anyone working on that is completely on a moral page with us. But until there is something to criminalise the destruction of those things, there is no way to protect that right. So what our campaign is all about, and what Polly Higgins, who I work with and have been closely working with for the last 4 years, what she has been dedicating her life to really for the last decade, since stepping away from a very lucrative career as a barrister herself, is driving forward the adjustment of criminal law internationally. So the amendment to the key governing document for international criminal law, which is the Rome Statute. That document governs the International Criminal Court and the crimes that it currently has jurisdiction over, which are war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and more recently, crimes of aggression. What we want added to that is ecocide. And we know that that was in the original drafting back in the 90s, but certain countries vetoed it at the time. So it's not a new concept, if you like. But we're wanting ecocide to be added as a standalone crime. And that can sound very remote and kind of pie in the sky. Of course, wouldn't we all want that to happen? You know, let's outlaw ecosystem destruction and everything will be all right. Yes, in a way, that's not an understatement, in the sense that if you criminalise something, you're able to prosecute. There's a big difference between suing and prosecuting. So the difference between civil and criminal law. If somebody beats you up in the street, you don't sue them, you go to the police and the police prosecutes them because it's a crime. That's the difference between, you know, the kinds of actions, of which there are hundreds of wonderful actions going on around the world where people are suing fossil fuel companies, ecocidal companies of all descriptions. And it's brilliant that that's happening. But actually stopping that activity requires a criminal law. And what most people don't realise is how possible that is. Unlike creating a law, amending a law is much simpler. In fact, our government's past masters are doing that without us noticing, and generally in ways we don't approve of. But it is possible to amend international law because any member of the International Criminal Court, of which there are currently 124, anyone can make an amendment, can table an amendment. Once that amendment is there as a tabled amendment, it can't be vetoed. And any member can make that amendment. So, of course, it's not going to be the UK doing that. Okay, the UK is not going to move first on this. We're a big fossil fuel state. So are a number of others. The big economies are unlikely to move on this first. But there are plenty of small countries who are climate vulnerable and at the sharp end of this. For example, the Pacific Islands, with whom we've been directly working. I'd love to take questions in a little bit, if that's all right.
Just wonder whether the 124 members are countries or people?
Countries. Thank you. Yeah, so that you have member states. And any of those member states can make that amendment. We've been working with the small Pacific Islands because they're the ones that are at the sharp end of climate breakdown. So they're already suffering, 10 typhoons a year rather than 1 typhoon a decade. I mean, I'm getting my figures exactly right there, but the proportions are strong. And there's now evidence to show that, increase in this particular kind of industrial activity, e.g. the carbon majors, the fossil fuel companies and so on, the increases in certain activity have actually a direct correlation. That is actually, that is demonstrable now. And these islands are in a state of existential crisis. If your island is only, a metre above sea level, you're looking at, climate breakdown very quickly. You're looking at huge numbers of climate migrants. You're looking at something that's a really very existential crisis and right on your doorstep. And that is why those islands actually have the most incentive to put forward this change in the law. And we are actually working with them. And for the first time, at the end of 2018, one of those islands announced that it had the intention of discussing this and considering taking it forward. So that's very exciting. And what that means is not just that senior officials and senior management personnel, so CEOs of big companies, government ministers, can be prosecuted under a criminal law. In a similar context as, say, genocide, it's not the individual soldiers, if you like, who are being prosecuted. It's those in positions of senior responsibility. So this actually allows you to take the CEO of Shell, for example, or BP or ExxonMobil to court in a criminal context, as well as government ministers who are issuing permits that are leading to this kind of dangerous industrial activity. That is exciting in itself. But what's really exciting is that when you have a criminal law in place, you create a massive steer for society. I mean, the fact that we have a crime of genocide, the fact that nationally we have a crime of murder, has a massive effect on whether people consider killing anybody. It's phenomenal. I mean, that is the true power of creating a crime of ecocide. It creates a massive steer for state policy and for industrial practice. And so it's actually hugely, hugely powerful. And Polly often describes it as a trim tab, which is what Buckminster Fuller talked about when he said, "Call me the trim tab." I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's apparently a little part on a ship. You get to continue with Tim's ship analogy. It's a little part on a ship which, if turned, turns the rudder and ultimately turns the ship. Creating a crime of ecocide has that power. Potentially, that it really is one of the few things. I mean, for me, really, the only thing I've come across where, and which is why I'm now dedicating my life to this campaign, that I've come across that really has the potential to have the planetary ship steer in a different direction away from those rocks. Okay, it's massively, massively powerful. How does this relate to Extinction Rebellion? How does this relate to conscientious protectors standing up to prevent this crash on the rocks? Well, one thing is that historically, whenever there have been great freedoms won, whether it's been suffragettes, whether it's been civil rights, whether it's been the abolition of slavery, there's always been historically a combination of a strong grassroots movement and key legal cases and challenges. And so, we feel very much that with Extinction Rebellion and with this Extinction Rebellion overall legal approach, that we are at that nexus of really sort of bringing kind of legal cases and challenges together with a really strong grassroots movement that now has the global potential that no movement has had in the past. So that's hugely exciting. There's also there's an aspect to the actual structure of the Mission LifeForce campaign, which makes it hugely relevant to this, to these court cases, to individual court cases, your court cases, for example. Could I possibly have just a little show of hands of who actually has a case pending or a trial pending? So we've got a few, yeah. So this is what makes Mission LifeForce relevant specifically to you and to anybody taking actions with Extinction Rebellion. Any kind of action where your conscience effectively is saying, I can't sit by, I can't let this happen. And the way that this works is that our campaign is like a crowdfund. Okay, what we're actually doing is raising funds to support the process of those small islands taking the law forward at the criminal court. There are membership fees, there's accommodation and flights that they need. These are tiny islands who don't even think the criminal court is necessarily relevant to them until now, until there's the possibility that actually it can create a law that will help them. So a lot of what we're doing is making those connections and actually facilitating them actually being able to take that forward. So that's what the funds from the campaign are used for. But the means that whereby that happens is via a trust fund. It's a legal trust fund. And effectively, when you sign up to Mission LifeForce, you are signing, online, you are signing that trust fund document. It sounds, oh my God, what am I signing? There's absolutely no liabilities involved. There's no administrative things involved at all. All it means is that you are someone who has gifted into that trust fund, and therefore you're a trustee of that trust fund. That's all it is. Very, very simple. It's called the Earth Protectors Trust Fund, and I'm sure that all of us here consider ourselves already to be Earth protectors. Effectively, you're defining yourself, you're actually giving yourself a kind of a legal status as an Earth protector because you are a trustee of the Earth Protectors Trust Fund. That is made weightier, if you like, by the fact that for the first time, as far as we know, for the first time ever, this document has been, it's the first time a trust fund document has been done in this way. It has been legally rubber stamped, if you like, right across the world. Virtually every jurisdiction has rubber stamped this document. That doesn't necessarily mean they agree with its contents. It means that they recognise it as a valid legal document. What that means is it cannot be ignored by a court of law. And this is one of the key things that goes with the conscientious protector argument, is that effectively you have signed a legal document that has been recognised across the world as legally valid. It's effectively, what it becomes is primary evidence for your status as a conscientious protector. Effectively, you can say, I've acted on my conscience, and I can show this to you because I've signed this document, and this document has been legally acknowledged, apostilled is the legal word, across the world. And so a court actually can't ignore that. So that's one of the things that's very important about that. The conscientious protector approach also, it has two very strong aspects, very, very key aspects, which are absolutely in line with the aims of Extinction Rebellion. And the first of these is about sounding the alarm, which is, again, to come back exactly to what Tim was talking about. It's about, breaking into the captain's cabin and saying, look, do you realise what's happening? Effectively, it's about making noise, and it's about making sure that the court hears what's happening. Your freedom of conscience, which is enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that right to freedom of conscience effectively gives you the ability to make your case. It's like a little wedge. It doesn't mean that the information you're about to present is subjective. As Tim has very clearly explained, the jury is in on climate change. We are looking at climate breakdown. The evidence is there, and there are some very, very key public domain documents that mean that everybody knows this, the IPCC 1.5 degree report. And there's also the Paris Agreement, where the whole world has agreed that certain industrial activities create emissions, and the emissions have this effect. This is not in dispute. This is not in dispute. So the information that you're presenting is not subjective information, but what allows you to present it is this relying on this right to freedom of conscience. Now, it's absolutely true that it's not a defence in its own right, but it's, if you like, it's an underpinning for whatever defence that you might be using. Necessity, for example, prevention of greater harm, duress of circumstance. These accepted defences are supplemented, if you like, by relying on your right to freedom of conscience. And so far, all those who have used it have been given the space to say why they did what they did. And I know from my own point of view, coming from an activist campaigning background, it's the one thing we want. We want to be heard as to why we are doing what we're doing. And it prevents the court from closing you down and saying this is not a trial about fracking, for example. I mean, actually, the times it's been used most so far have been in regards to fracking. Or saying that, we're just talking about whether or not you obstructed the road. We're not talking about, we're not talking about fracking here. This is not a trial about fracking, for example. Or this is not a trial about climate change. This is not a trial about climate change. The simple answer to that is, no, you're right. This is not a trial about climate change. This is a trial about my right to freedom of conscience. I'm not a criminal. I'm a conscientious protector. I'm relying on my right to freedom of conscience. And the court needs to hear what informs that conscience. And at that point, you have the possibility to produce that scientifically accepted, universally acknowledged information that actually, in the case of climate breakdown, is really simple and clear. Actually, with the fracking cases, we've had quite large dossiers of the various different aspects, that potentially are contested or whatever. With climate breakdown, it's easier. We've got the IPCC report, we've got the Paris Agreement. Tim would be able to point us to the best documents to show that the government is not taking action. The way that we've prepared these sort of a template approach for court, if you like, allows you, if you wish, to add in extra documents. That's one side of what makes the conscientious protector approach so compatible with the Extinction Rebellion's aims, is that sounding the alarm factor. The other one is this, and this is where we start to get into what's a bit different about this approach to court. And the other one is this. One of the things that Extinction Rebellion are saying quite sort of loud and clear is that we have plenty of people willing to get arrested, potentially some of them willing to go to jail. This is a huge thing. As Tim was saying, this is a massive sacrifice that people are being prepared to make. And it's one that we know historically has been impactful, people's preparation to make that sacrifice. And it is one that also is down to every individual in their own particular case. One of the reasons that today is a shorter training than the ones we first did is that in our early trainings we gave lots and lots of detail out, and what we found is that actually it wasn't until people were actually faced with the trial or even their first plea hearing that they actually then wanted to refocus on detail, because actually it's quite a big thing, and people do change their minds as well, and that's fine. That can happen as well. People can have the intention of doing one thing and decide to do another. We had our first conscientious protectors. We had a group of them, and one decided in the end that for simply shortening the whole process and making it as less stressful as possible, decided to plead guilty, and that's completely fine. And she had a very low fine and a caution and so on. So it is a very individual thing. But here's the thing: if you're not necessarily trying to get acquitted, it means that you can do certain things, you can use approaches in court that you wouldn't necessarily normally use, or that trained lawyers are more inclined to discount or dismiss because they don't necessarily, in the trained legal mind, lead to an acquittal. Because if you're a trained lawyer, it's your job to win your case. That is what you're supposed to do. Okay, so we've had people kind of with total sympathy with what the information is that activists are wanting to bring, but not necessarily wanting to use the conscientious protector approach because they know it's not an established defence, and so they don't think it's going to help. And what that's meant is that the times that this has been most effective is when people represent themselves, which again is another step for somebody to want to do. But I'd also like to put in a bit of reassurance here, because when you are a litigant in person, which is what it's called when you represent yourself, when you're a litigant in person, the court literally has to bend over backwards for you to present whatever defence you like. Okay, and they have to be really accommodating with you. That's actually what they're trained to do. And if they're not doing that, then you actually have grounds for complaint, because they actually have the judges are trained to treat you with respect, almost with kid gloves, compared to if you had a barrister representing you. And our experience so far with the cases that we've had so far, we haven't had loads, but we've had more than half a dozen cases use this over the last few months. It's actually more than that now. And in every case, when somebody has been self-representing, they have been given the space to present those arguments, which, as Tim said at the beginning, it's so important that the judiciary hear as well. And so, effectively, if what you're trying to do is create a window to provide this information, it may not matter to you. You may be able to say, look, I don't mind if you convict me, because actually the point of me doing this is to sound the alarm on this, and that is what my conscience is telling me I must do. Then, it kind of gives you that added leeway for how you can communicate in a court. It also, as I say, it's also kind of in line with the Extinction Rebellion's kind of approach to this. Effectively the sort of slight, if you like, the kind of sacrificial approach. So, if and you will know whether that resonates for you to do that. But also again, on a note of reassurance, those who have used it have received the absolute minimum sentences. And so far, they've all been magistrates' court cases. We haven't yet had any Crown Court cases. But in the magistrates' court, generally speaking, we're finding that magistrates are a bit more conventional and less likely to kind of push the boat out and maybe consider acquitting for something that has not been previously used, or arguments that have not been previously put. So there's a bit of a kind of wanting to stick to a line here, but we've had magistrates have to take a break and go for a walk before giving their sentence, because they've been so shaken by what they've heard. And we've, in one case, one of our defendants had the entire courtroom in tears except for the prosecutor and the judge. Another one had the prosecutor come up to her afterwards and offer to take her out for a glass of wine. He was so impressed with how she presented. And she had been told she would only be given an hour and a half, and she was actually given the entire day and as many witnesses as she wanted. Though, we can't obviously guarantee that a judge or magistrate is going to be that open, and we have also had the opposite. We've had a couple of very hostile judges. We've had a couple of, in fact, to slightly correct what I said earlier, we have actually had conscientious protectors in Crown Court, but not with a jury trial yet. So we've had them in Crown Court with an appeal from a magistrates' court. Your result at a magistrates' court can be appealed. You have a right to appeal it regardless of what happens if you want to do that. And if you do, the Crown Court has to hear your case, and they have to treat it as a new case. They may try not to, we had that happen as well, but they are supposed to treat it as a new case. So you get your sort of second bite of the cherry, if you like. And in the Crown Court, we happened to have a very hostile judge on one occasion. But because of the nature of the relying on the freedom of conscience, the defendants were still able to put their points across. I'd like to kind of stop there for a moment to take any immediate questions that have come up. Try and keep them brief.
Do we try and do an action that gets us to Crown Court immediately, but then if we lose a Crown Court, it could look like a custodial sentence, because that's what Crown Court's all about. That's the transition. You don't tend to get custodial sentence at magistrate court, or you can do. That's the bridge, isn't it? And that's the sort of tension I'm in when I'm sort of thinking about my action design for this year, next year.
This is a very good question, and we do actually have prepared a kind of activist sentencing guide, which is available on the Mission LifeForce website, on the activist toolkit page there, which gives you an idea of the kinds of offences that activists are normally charged with, and whether those are summary offences and therefore just tribal at the magistrates' court, whether they're triable either way, because there are some that you can choose, or whether they would go straight to the Crown Court. So if you like, sort of a bit of a menu. That's one way of looking at it. If your intention is specifically to forward this particular strategy.
I think the boring legal answer is probably to advise against people trying to game the system, because if your defence is kind of necessity, I'm avoiding a greater harm, part of that is saying my actions were proportionate, they were reasonable, I was doing the minimum necessary to raise that alarm. And if the question is, well, why did you have to do exactly £5,000 worth of damage and 1p?
Why did you have to
That then becomes difficult.
Yeah.
So I think there are real risks with actually trying to game the system like that.
Yeah, that's good advice, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. I think it's absolutely right. One has to be aware of what the risks are. I think the other thing that we need to also bear in mind, and you know, we have a little bit of a sort of I'd use the word, it's like tragicomedy going on, in that one of the aims of, I believe the aims of Extinction Rebellion, and I'm happy to be corrected on that, but certainly one of the aims of Mission LifeForce is to take a new narrative into the courts, is to take, and into the world in general. And that does involve risk. It doesn't mean you have to take it. It doesn't mean you should want to take it. It's individual. But part of this whole narrative of what we're all involved in Extinction Rebellion about, in our various different ways, is precisely trying to change that narrative, is looking at changing that narrative. One of the reasons that we feel the conscientious protector approach plays into that, and therefore kind of supplements, if you like, a sort of straight necessity defence, is precisely because it taps into a narrative. The black letter of the law is what it is, but actually, in practice, a judge and a jury does not have to completely follow it. They are there to uphold what is fair and just. And actually, we already know of an instance where a judge has said to a farmer who was in a situation where the neighbouring farm was dumping toxic muck onto his land or very close to his land, and he was absolutely furious about it, and he decided to just take the matter into his own hands and dump it back on the neighbour's land. And he ended up in court. And the judge actually said to him, well, sounds like you might want to be looking at Article 9 here, because this sounds like an act of conscience, effectively. You're taking the poison away from your land, because you can't sit by and let it be toxified, if you like. So we know that there are judges out there who are open to this, and we know that some of them are in quite high courts, and we also know that the conscientious protector narrative taps into something, particularly in this country, because we have a very strong awareness culturally of the conscientious objector narrative from the 20th century. So that is already very much accepted by, everybody knows what that refers to. The judiciary will all be familiar with the idea of a conscientious objector. And the conscientious objectors actually took decades to win the right to freedom of conscience. At the beginning, conscientious objectors were shot or jailed. It was only in the late 40s when the right to freedom, in fact the legislation changed in the late 30s, I believe, but the actual declarations of human rights happened in the late 40s, where right to freedom of conscience was actually then enshrined in law. And that was the work of many, many conscientious objectors at the beginning of the 20th century. And interestingly, that right, on the whole, has been reserved, it's been kind of, in most people's minds, it's associated with religion. For example, because it was the Quakers who were so instrumental in taking it forward as a peaceful practice, if you like. And so it's kind of been, in a sense, left in a bit of a niche. And what the idea of the conscientious protector does is it resurrects that in another context, but a context that taps into a narrative that's already very, very strong in our culture. And so it's one that taps in very quickly for the judiciary, as for many others. So it's again, it's kind of, in a sense, riding on a story that people are familiar with into new territory. Because in the 21st century, it's actually environmental crime, the biggest crime that is happening, precisely as Tim outlined, is the environment, is the global ecocide that is happening, both in many sort of particular instances, but also in the instance of climate breakdown overall. So there is a kind of real echo in that narrative. And that is what the conscientious protector thing taps into. So there is, there is a way that, yes, it is taking a risk to take something up to higher court, or to effectively intend to take this narrative into the court. But at the same time, we know that on the whole it doesn't result in heavier sentences, on the contrary. And also that in the context of Extinction Rebellion, we have people who are more likely than the average to potentially be interested in using it. I think it's like Tim's like a little conscience that sits on my shoulder when we're talking of consciences, in terms of always be aware that people have different levels of how they feel, different levels of vulnerability, and representing oneself in court can be quite intimidating, and not everybody wants to do it. In fact, Tim and Plan B have also very kindly said that there is potential for people to accompany. Am I right in saying this? Yeah. That there's potential for people to accompany a conscientious protector into court. Actually, even just an Extinction Rebellion activist, I don't think they have to be a conscientious protector, or they have to be using that strategy, but as what's called a Mackenzie friend, or an amicus, so somebody who can come and sort of sit with you and chat with you and support you as the case goes on. So there are various elements that can also support you in that way. I did want to, just before I move on to a few more specifics of the procedure, which a lot of it will be in common, of course, with anybody who just decides to use to be legally represented as well. But I just wanted to just come back to focus on what you are actually signing when you sign up to Mission LifeForce. Essentially, the vast part of the document is just the legalese saying this is what the funds can be used for the islands to do this, and for forwarding Ecocide law at the International Criminal Court and so on. But what you're also doing, and this is germane to the conscientious protector stance, is you're making a statement and you're legally putting your name to it. And this is the statement you're making. Becoming a trustee of this document is to become an earth protector and trustee of the earth. It is a declaration of love and acknowledgement that the earth, the ecosystems of earth and inhabitants of earth, whether human or otherwise, have the right to peaceful enjoyment. It is a declaration of belief that this peaceful enjoyment is both a moral and legal right, and that any human act or omission which severely diminishes such peaceful enjoyment is a crime. Becoming a trustee of the earth is to become protector of a law which is in alignment with a universally recognised moral code of respect, peace, and a duty of care for all life. It is a direct expression of intent to create peace between all beings. So it's actually quite a heartfelt statement, in a sense, that you're making by signing this document. And even if, there may be people, for example, that want to use it in a court context, but got arrested before they signed up. A court is a bit more convinced by it if you signed up first. But even if you didn't, effectively, if you had understood and known about it, you probably would have. So you're still able to present that and to sign up before your trial and use it as part of your dossier in court, if you like, your bundle as it's called. And it also brings me to why we're called Mission LifeForce. It's about aligning the force of law with the force of life. And we saw it as a kind of a mission rather than just a normal campaign. It is a campaign too, but yeah. And that kind of also perhaps ties in with the kind of strength of belief thing. Because in fact, and this has been legally acknowledged, and we use it as part of the documents that we provide, there is case law to show that the courts have accepted man-made climate change as a deeply held personal belief, which falls into the right to freedom of conscience kind of category in a similar way to, say, being a Quaker, as in it's something that kind of runs right through you and colours your entire way of being and way of living. So that has been legally acknowledged as that kind of a belief. And also in not just in a work context or but actually in a whole life context. There are two cases that together basically show that and are quite persuasive in the criminal court. So that's an added little perspective on that. Does anybody have? I'm just thinking it might be good if there's anybody who's got questions on the more kind of general, what I've said so far. Then now might be a good moment.
How are you defining what? I mean, apart from vegans, we're destroying our life force to eat, and even plant life, according to Mission LifeForce, which is due love and respect, and yet we're eating plants as well. So where does that fit in with the fact that you've got to destroy some sort of life?
Perhaps it would help actually for me to just outline the definition of ecocide, because it's sort of linked to that context. Because we're well aware that in nature, animals kill each other and eat each other, and nobody's trying to say that the lion has to make peace with the lamb right in front of us physically now. It's not so much about that. But with ecocide crime, what we're looking at is impact, and how serious that is. So, ecocide crime is acts or this is the working draft that's been developed with criminal lawyers. Ecocide crime is acts or omissions committed recklessly in times of peace or conflict by any senior person within the course of state, corporate, or any other entity's activity, which cause, contribute to, or may be expected to cause or contribute to, serious ecological, climate, or cultural loss or damage to, or destruction of ecosystems of a given territory, such that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants has been or will be severely diminished. Okay, so you're looking at a kind of a big effect, if you like, and to establish seriousness, the impacts must be widespread, long-term, or severe. So you're not, for example, prosecuting someone for eating a sausage. You're also not prosecuting someone for driving a car, because when it comes down to it, it's actually it's not the individuals that are actually creating the long-term and serious damage. It's not the consumers, if you like. It's at government policy level, it's at industrial practice level. So similarly, when you're talking about severely diminish peaceful enjoyment, you're talking about big scale. And obviously, I completely agree with you that well, at least I don't know if this is what you're saying, but one thing I inferred from your question is that the way we farm meat could absolutely be a target for ecocide crime. Could absolutely be a context for prosecutions of ecocide crime. So yeah. One more. I've got a question here and a couple over there.
It's a little bit related. I just wondered, with when you sign that document, which I have done, you become a trustee of this fund. What's the legal status of those trustees in terms of their responsibility? So I'm just thinking of an extreme case where someone signs it who is also the CEO of what I mean? Like, will you be held? Should they be, and are they held to account? How are those trustees then used when that goes forward, or is it? Are they not?
To be honest, they're not. You're not. It's not. No, it's not like a charity or a board of a charity, or a trustee of a charity, or something like that, or of an actual trust, because this isn't actually a legal entity. It's simply a trust fund. So you're a trustee of a trust fund. But if I completely understand your question, and a lot of people do ask this because they sort of think, well, hang on, if I'm a trustee of a charity, then I have responsibilities for this, that, and the other. This actually doesn't work like that. I have to say, if you're the CEO of a company and you're signing this, you're going to be leaving your job pretty damn soon, because you would be. They're not you. No, not you. But I mean, if somebody were, I mean, I just think that kind of discrepancy is extremely unlikely to arise. But also, we're not looking at a document which it obliges anyone to do anything. In fact, in a sense, all it's saying is that this is what I believe. I want to put my funds behind making ecocide a crime, and that's pretty much the end of it. As a conscientious protector, as an earth protector, you may personally feel that your role as a protector of that law is to tell as many people about Mission LifeForce as possible, or to hold an event, or to join Extinction Rebellion and actually put your body in the way. There's a whole range of ways that you could interpret that, but none of those are obligatory. So, yeah. Lady in the black coat, yeah.
Hi. Firstly, I have to say I think the idea of setting up a trust where protection can be given to individuals is so innovative, and I think it's such a brilliant thing that you guys have done, and I used to be a lawyer, so you're very well done there. In terms of, you said it's very, it's the conscientious objector concept is quite familiar. I have to say I wasn't that familiar about it in terms of its acceptance. So could you tell us a little bit more? So I understand civil rights movement, all of that. Is there anything more recent that we can rely on to sort of compare what we might be doing now in terms of recognising this conscientious objector principle that is widely understood?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the reason why the phrase conscientious protector has resonance for a lot of people, and I apologise, I guess that was probably an unconscious assumption that everybody knew what I was talking about when I said conscientious objectors, and there's no particular reason why that should be the case. The reason that conscientious protector has resonance is because it sounds like conscientious objector, and it's about the conscience. And the conscientious objectors were people who refused to fight in the First World War, and then subsequently in the Second World War, who were basically refused to go to war because they saw war as a serious harm and an evil that they wished to take no part in. And if you like, what we're aiming to kind of imply is that with a conscientious protector, you're seeing the harm, yes, you're wanting no part of it, but actually beyond that, you're saying, I can't sit by and actually watch this happen. I have to stop it happening in some way. And it could be that way is simply putting some money behind people changing the law. It could be that way is joining Extinction Rebellion and swarming on a road in London. But either way, the concept is very similar. It's the perception of an evil that's happening, and the sense that deep in oneself, one cannot live with that, and one has to do something, because if one doesn't, one is complicit. And that is effectively what is happening at a governmental level. If action is not being taken, effectively that means that the government is complicit in what is happening, because they're not acting to prevent it. And that is, whole raison d'etre.
There's a really good history of this in the Houseman's Peace Diary, the current one. If you sort of go to Houseman's Bookshop, which is just down Caledonian Road near King's Cross, and the introduction to the Peace Diary, it's basically a history of 60 or so years since they've been in this shop, and it basically covers all the history of conscientious objection. It's like written about 10 pages, 10, 12 pages. It's a really good summary of the process.
Thank you, Al. We'll take two more questions, and then we're going to have a quick break, and then we'll get more into the sort of nitty-gritty of the documentation and so on.
Is there, or should there be, some means of vetting those people who wish to sign this document? Because I can see several ways in which it can be abused. If for instance, I was a minor criminal, I might want to sign it and then pretend my crime was to do with this for these causes. Or now or in the future, it may become a kind of fad to sign up to it, and you will get all kinds of people who have no interest whatsoever in protecting life forms on the planet Earth that are signing up because everybody else is signing up, and because it's all seen as a status symbol or something. Is there anything at all that is or should be there to
look at? I have to say, I understand what you're saying. We are not, generally speaking, worried about that. If you're a petty criminal and you're trying to use this in court to say that you did what you did for reasons of conscience, I'd be very surprised if your judge was taken in. So we're not really worried about that aspect. In terms of it becoming a fad, we really hope it does, because then we're going to be able to say, look how many people really believe this thing, they've all signed it. So, yeah, I mean, I think... I mean, if it gets to the stage where people are seeing it as a positive status thing to have signed Mission LifeForce, I will have done my job. I mean, that I'll be very happy. So yeah, I'm not. Essentially, we're not worried about that. The gentleman at the back.
For a Mackenzie friend, do they have to be legally trained, or can you just bring someone in here?
They
Tim's the one to
don't. Yeah, no,
answer.
they don't have to be legally trained, and it's not absolutely a guaranteed right. But usually, a magistrate's court, if you say, "I would like somebody to assist me, I'm not legally represented," they will allow you to have a Mackenzie friend. It's just somebody that you feel confident can speak for you and present your position to the court.
Can they be legally trained? Or?
They can be, absolutely, of course. I mean, that can be an advantage. Sometimes people say somebody's a bit legally trained can be the worst of all possible worlds there. Because the risk is you have someone who annoys the court by trying to be a little bit too clever without really understanding how it works. Yeah.
What name for it, you said? You said 2 names? Mackenzie friend and amicus.
Sometimes I think it's known as an amicus, or amicus brief to do that.
Yeah, in this context, I think probably Mackenzie friend would be the form that you'd use. Yeah.
And in fact, I think the courts now are starting to accept it just being described as a friend. So I mean, there is a sort of a drive to try and make it all a little bit more layperson friendly. So there is that also going on. Had a question in the front here.
Is there any footage available of us to watch other people using these arguments in court?
We haven't got actual court footage. I'm not sure how. You probably know more about the actual legality of how that works.
So it's a good question because it's 2019, and you'd think the idea of open justice meant a little bit more than whoever can cram into Court 76 down this rabbit warren of the High Court somewhere, but actually at the moment it doesn't. I mentioned we're bringing a legal action against the government for their Heathrow plans. We just made an application on Tuesday to the High Court to live stream the proceedings. We said these proceedings are relevant to everybody in this country. It's their futures on trial, it's their lives on trial, it's not just the 100 and so people who can get into the courtroom. Amazingly, that application has never been made before. The court is thinking about it. We put them under some pressure. We got a petition with 1,600 names. But you don't have live footage from the criminal courts at the moment. There is actually law that stops that. So we'll come on to this a little bit later. You won't get live footage. We're putting together these documents that are meant to be live documents. We're calling them beta versions. You know, when somebody puts out a computer program that's still in development and they want other programmers to look at it, to, you know, sort out the bugs, it's a beta version. We want everybody to feedback on their experiences, so we update these documents and everybody knows they're seeing something that captures the experience of people all around the country who are doing the same thing. So it's a collaborative effort. In that way, we really do want to make sure that you and whoever else is going through the court is learning from everybody else. But it won't be video footage, unfortunately.
At least one court in this country is set up for live streaming because back in 2011, I believe it was, there was a mock Ecocide trial held in the Supreme Court, and it was the first one ever to be live streamed. So it is the possibility, technically, the possibility is there.
The Supreme Court does it, the Court of Appeal has just started doing it.
Right, but it hasn't sort of trickled down yet to the general court system. One of the things that is also happening now is that documents are, in most courts now, I think electronic documents are now accepted. So, for example, even 6 months ago, people using this defence were submitting these big bundles of papers, which actually can be quite costly to reproduce. You know, you need a bundle for the court, a bundle for the prosecutor, and so on. And now many courts will accept that in electronic format, and soon I think it will be everybody. Okay, we'll take a quick break now. So welcome back. I'd like to spend the first sort of 10 to 15 minutes just kind of going through the kind of procedures of, you know, what happens in terms of, you know, arrest and court, and, you know, what the sort of sequence is. And there's a document here that sort of runs through the kind of basics, if you like, that you can take a copy of if you haven't already, as well as the overall exile legal strategy. We are focusing particularly on what happens in terms of, once you've got your notification to go to court. Tim will also have more sort of detail about, what you can be advised with in terms of the actual process of arrest and police interviews and so on. That this training is not focusing so much on that specific aspect, but Tim is here and happy to take questions. And then probably just maybe at 4:45, I'll get Polly on the phone as well, so that she can say hi to you all, because she was really sad that she couldn't make it today, and also to take any other specific questions you may have, because she has half a lifetime of court experience, and so that's the one thing that I'm intensely grateful for the presence of Tim at this, because while I've worked with Polly for 4 years, I don't have that in-depth kind of court expertise and criminal court expertise as well. What I do have is experience of being arrested, which she hasn't and isn't about to. So, we kind of, our whole kind of collaboration came from this combination of the legal background and the campaigning/activist background. So that's where Mission LifeForce was born, at that kind of, meeting point, if you like. To just sort of run through the Conscientious Protector approach as a sort of court approach, we do sort of just pop 3 key things to remember. One is, so the idea is to give the court a reason to listen to you. So state why your conscience informs you. So this means that when it's your moment to speak, that you actually do give some background, and this is something that I'll come to in a minute with the specific documents. A statement of conscience, which will include something about yourself, about what makes you that caring person, what makes you care, effectively. So state why your conscience informs you. Back up any assertion you make with primary evidence, and as I say with the climate breakdown, that's really relatively simple, because we have the IPCC report, we have the Paris Agreement, and we also have numerous government documents that will show that, and scientific peer-reviewed papers to make it very clear what the case is. So, I've already mentioned this fact that as a litigant in person you have an advantage, because you get given more time to speak if you're representing yourself, and the court is actually sort of duty bound to assist you to do that. But after you've been arrested, you will receive some kind of notification of a date to it, assuming you're charged. You'll receive some kind of a date to attend the Magistrates' Court or the Crown Court for your first hearing. If you intend to plead not guilty, and this is a key thing here, this approach is steps into its own, if you like, with a not guilty plea. Because what you're saying is you're not trying to deny that you did the thing you did. Okay, so a lot of people get this confusion between the idea of pleading guilty and the idea of denying what they did. Okay, the fact that you're pleading not guilty doesn't mean you're saying I wasn't in the road, for example. What it means is you're saying I did that thing, but that doesn't make me a criminal. I am not guilty of a crime. I do not believe I'm a criminal. So it's a not guilty plea that you're likely to be giving if you're really wanting to run with this. However, if you do wish to plead guilty for reasons of your own, or for expedience, or for whatever it is, or so that you can go out and reoffend again, whatever your reason is for doing that, you can still use these documents as a mitigation for sentence, so that you can still use them, but they really come into their own if you're wanting to have that day in court or hour in court, whatever it is. You will need to prepare, once you know your court date, if you're wanting to have an expert witness, which you may want to do. There's no obligation to do it, and as Tim's put very clearly, I think in this summary document, there's also reasons why in the case of climate breakdown you may not need to. Expert witnesses are often used for sort of contentious issues. So, for example, in the fracking cases that we've had, it's made a lot of sense to have, say, an expert on seismicity or earthquakes or whatever, for example. That may be less germane in a climate breakdown case, but if you do want to have an expert witness, remember that an expert witness is not just somebody well known with an opinion, it's somebody who's a recognised expert in their field, so that they've had peer-reviewed academic papers, or they're even logged as a legally recognised expert witness. In your first court hearing, this is just a plea hearing. This is for you to state whether you're pleading guilty or not guilty. And the prosecution will give you the disclosure of their documents, which basically means the information that they have about your charge and the circumstances that arose leading to it. And in that first plea hearing, if you do want to bring an expert witness to your trial, that's the time when you say so. And the reason that we note the question of whether you want to bring an expert witness before that is that you will need to give the court any dates that expert can't make, so that the court is then able to give, to look up a trial date with their listings officer. You will also at that stage, you can notify the court that you will be preparing a bundle for your trial. And that's important because the court will then be able to tell you when you need to serve that, or you can even ask when you need to serve that, but they will say, we need to have those documents by X date, whatever, so that's important. You may be asked, and this happened to me when I was arrested, you may be asked what arguments you plan to use. You don't have to go into any detail at that stage. You can. In fact, what Polly usually advises people is to actually put as many in as possible, because actually it does, particularly if you're planning to represent yourself, they have to let you use anything you like. So you can say, I want to use necessity, prevention of greater harm, duress of circumstance, all of those things all at once, if you want to. And say, you can say, I will be relying on my right to freedom of conscience when I make these defences. And that way, at no point can the judge say, you can't submit that because you didn't tell us you were going to, which does happen. So if you want to cover all your bases, you can do that. You can say that you want to use all those defences, if you wish. And we do know of cases that people have been closed down because they've tried to submit something at the trial that they haven't previously claimed that they're going to use. But you don't have to go into the detail at that stage. So then moving on to the documents that you will then need to serve on the court. The key one is your conscientious protector statement. And that is for you to set out fully why you did what you did. So it needs to be factual. You need to say what informs your belief, so the facts that have informed your belief. So effectively those key documents, the ones that are in the public domain, the ones that we can supply you with. And what actions you have already taken, as well as what the mission and aims are of Extinction Rebellion, assuming this is in the context of an Extinction Rebellion action. And we will be, this is one of the reasons we took your email earlier, is we will be providing a sort of template for that you can then, it's very important that you write your own. It's very important that it's your own words, it's your own truth that you're speaking, if you like, when you take it to court. Then your primary evidence of being a conscientious protector, this is where your Earth Protectors Trust Fund document and the certificate that comes with it, which is when we log that signing up, we log it on the blockchain so that nobody can say, it wasn't me, I didn't do it. It effectively is proof that you signed the thing at a certain date and time. So those documents are your primary evidence of being a conscientious protector, okay, and not just pulling that out of the hat. It shows that's a deep intent that you have had and that you carry with you. Then the primary evidence, then we're looking at the primary evidence of the serious harm. So the serious harm, in this case, being climate breakdown. So that will be, it could be as simple as 3 or 4 documents, but you may wish to supplement it with more. And I promise you, Tim's got a great bibliography if you want to do that. The key really obvious ones are the IPCC report that says we've got 12 years to take action. Of course, that doesn't mean taking it then, it means taking it now, in order to get there. But also what the government knows, and the Paris Agreement is universally acknowledged evidence of that the government knows that continuing with our emissions as we do is going to have that certain effect. And then finally, how the government is failing in their responsibility to protect. And examples would be things like promoting fracking, subsidising fossil fuels. Tim gave some examples earlier. And again, those are documents that we'll be closely communicating with Tim about because he's got more expertise on this particular arena than we have. Most of our specific research has been around fracking. And then any other documents that you wish to supplement with. As I said, we had somebody supplement with very specific, environmental regulations breaches by a company in her area. And if you're using this in the context of a local situation, like for example where I am, Al was mentioning it earlier, we've got an incinerator that nobody wants, nobody's ever wanted, they've been foisted on us, and there may well be some action around that. So somebody using the CP defence in that context might well supplement with specific documentation about incineration and how it damages the climate, for example. And effectively the court will want to know your defence. And this is where, again, Tim's information comes in very useful, but we also have and will have a kind of a defence submission for the conscientious protector approach, which goes through these sort of conventional defences that can be used and how they apply in the context of climate breakdown. And I think Tim's got a lot of supporting stuff for that as well. So did you act out of necessity? Did you act to prevent a greater crime? Did you act in defence of others? Did you act under duress of circumstance? Those can all be made, those are all relevant to an XR action. And one of the things that is worth thinking about in that context is this idea of immediacy, because often the court will say, well, hang on, if you were preventing a greater crime, or if you were acting out of necessity because something awful was going to happen if you didn't, where was the awful thing that was about to happen? Because criminal courts are often thinking, they're thinking in the context of, socking someone in the head that's about to knife someone. Okay, so it's very, very instant and immediate. Actually, there are good arguments to suggest that on the broader perspective that we're dealing with climate breakdown, the danger is immediate. Just because, this island isn't going underwater tomorrow, or, just because that doesn't make it not immediate when you're talking about the entire species and its future. If you're talking about 12 years for the entire species and its future, or quite possibly less according to, to some information, then that is pretty darn immediate. Okay, so there is a strong argument for that sort of immediacy factor that kind of, contextualizes these defences in this kind of context. So all those documents are your bundle, what the courts call a bundle. This is the one that we used for fracking, or variations of in different cases, and this is quite chunky because it goes into quite a few of the different, very specific problems with fracking. It can actually be in the climate breakdown case. It can be almost as simple as you like. It could be it can be as simple as 3 or 4 documents, as well as your protector's document and your statement of conscience. The key thing with when you actually get into court is how you present. I want to just quickly run a very short little video. Actually, they've got this wonderful funky setup here that I haven't used yet. It's just a quick run through, and it's a university video, a quick run through of how a criminal court functions, just so that you have a picture of it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the presentation.
I am the judge, and it's my job to interpret and uphold the law. Other people present during a trial at the Crown Court are the prosecution barrister and the defence barrister, usually with solicitors behind them taking notes, and the jury. The defendant will sit in the dock and be present during the trial. It is at my discretion whether or not there is a public gallery. After the jury has been sworn in, I address them directly. I inform them that it is for them to decide if the evidence they are going to hear proves the defendant's guilt. I also inform them that it is their job to consider the evidence, not the law, and that I will guide them if necessary on points of law.
I am the next person to address the jury. I introduce myself and explain that I appear on behalf of the prosecution in this case, and my learned friend, who I name, appears on behalf of the defence. I then outline the prosecution case, explaining each offence and the evidence the jury will hear in proving this. I will state that it is the prosecution's responsibility to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the offence that they are before the court for. I will introduce the first prosecution witness. I will then ask a series of questions with regards to the evidence they have given in a statement to the police. This is known as examination in chief. Upon completion of this, the defence may ask the witness a series of questions. This is known as cross-examination. Upon completion of the cross-examination, I may be given the opportunity to ask a further series of questions to the witness. This is known as re-examination. I will continue to call witnesses until all the witnesses have been called to the stand. I will announce to the court that this is the case for the prosecution.
this point in the case, I may make an application of no case to answer to the judge, stating that the prosecution has not raised sufficient evidence to prove that the defendant has committed the alleged offence. If he finds in favour of my application, he will instruct the jury to find the defendant not guilty, and then he will release the defendant. This is an acquittal. If the judge considers the prosecution has raised enough evidence, then I will continue with my case. As with the prosecution barrister, I will introduce the witnesses. However, at this time, they will be giving evidence for the defence. This will follow in the same procedure of examination in chief, cross-examination, and then re-examination. At the end, I will declare that was the case for the defence.
I then stand and give what is called my closing speech, where I outline the prosecution case and try to persuade the jury that the defendant is in fact guilty.
I then stand and give my closing speech, outlining the defence's case and trying to persuade the jury that the defendant is not guilty.
I will then sum up all the evidence. I will direct the jury on the legal issues and what the prosecution has to prove if they are to find the defendant guilty. I will give them the legal options available, reminding them that if they are not sure, they must find the defendant not guilty.
We then retire to make our decision. Once a decision has been reached, we return, and as foreperson of the jury, I announce the jury's verdict. If found not guilty, the defendant is released.
If the defendant is found guilty, I will make a statement in mitigation to the judge. The judge will take this statement into account before sentencing.
I thank the jury for the service that they have provided. If the defendant is found not guilty, I will release the jury from the court. If the defendant is found guilty, I will move to sentencing in a straightforward case. It is likely in that instance that the jury will remain in court. I may, however, postpone sentencing where other factors are to be considered. This can be particularly appropriate where there have been contentious issues or where the defendant's background is likely to have a significant impact on the sentence I pass.
So that's a kind of basic run-through of a criminal Crown Court trial. In a magistrate's court, it's a bit simpler because there's no jury, and there's simply a lay magistrate and 2 wing members. If you are in the Crown Court for appealing from a magistrate's court, you may well just have your Crown Court judge and also 2 lay magistrates. Whereas if you are actually looking at a Crown Court trial, in the first instance, you're looking at a jury as well. It was interesting, one of the things that the defence, it reminds me of something I hadn't mentioned, the defence barrister said, that they can potentially put that there is no case to answer. We have actually had that in one of the Conscientious Protector instances, where the prosecution, not the defence, the actual prosecution said to the judge, I'm not actually sure there is a case to answer here. Our defendant, or our Conscientious Protector, who didn't understand what that meant, when the judge said to him, do you believe there's a case to answer? He said, yes, there is. And actually, he could have just walked out at that stage. We didn't know that. But actually, what was interesting is that the judge actually was quite sympathetic. He said, I believe there is too. We need to, and he actually sort of allowed the thing to proceed so that all the aspects could be heard, which I thought was very interesting. So effectively, if somebody says that if they do decide there's no case to answer, then obviously, you can go straight away. But I thought it was quite interesting that just almost by mistake, the Conscientious Protector gave himself the space to actually then put his case. So that was kind of an interesting twist to that. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is something that Tim pointed out as well, is that just sort of, I suppose it's a reiteration really. So far, no Conscientious Protector case has actually led to an acquittal. We know that it's possible that it could, and I gave you the reasons earlier, and some of the judges that we know, and we know of, and we know that there is the possibility there, and particularly with a jury trial where the jury gets to make a decision based on what they've heard, there's more possibility there. But we do not guarantee it, and we do not know how long it's going to take. It took the conscientious objectors 30 years to get recognised. We don't believe it's going to take anything like that long. with conscientious protection. But what we're involved, effectively what we're aiming at with what we're presenting is a change in the perception of what activists are doing. So they are, in other words, saying, we are not criminals, we are conscientious protectors. Our conscience tells us, actually, what we kind of all know in our hearts, we should not be destroying the planet. So, it's about a sort of larger narrative. In terms of how, I do want to say a little bit about presentation in court. One of the things that has worked really well for conscientious protectors is the fact that they have a clear and coherent bundle ready, and they're able to say, when it comes to their time on the witness stand, they're on the in the dock. I'm not sure what the usual phrase is. They are able to articulate themselves in a clear way. So you would have your bundle with you in court, and it does involve a bit of preparation. This is something that doesn't. You will need to spend a good day to a few days just kind of looking through your things. I would say, set aside at least a whole day to do this, and keep making the points that you want to make, so that you're able to say to you're taking them on a journey. You're taking them on a journey. So you're wanting to say, this is who I am. This is why I did what I did. This is what informs my conscience. This is what substantiates, why I did what I did. And if the judge is kind of going, oh my gosh, are we going to have to listen to, if there's this sort of, you can actually summarize your documents quite succinctly if you need to. In reality, it may give you a lot more leeway to describe what you want to describe and to really sort of, say how you feel about it. But they will really respect and be grateful for the fact that you have prepared. Because actually you're then speaking to them in a language that they understand. You've got, these bundles have, there's an index, so you've got an index of the documents, you've got what they call a page referencer, so you can say, you can show them that, I want to make this point on this page, and you can say, you can take them to that page, and they will have it in front of them, either on their laptop, or if it's actually on paper, and you can say, I'd like to take you to this page, and you can look and you can see when they're ready for you to make your point. You don't have to worry about having to rush. I mean, you can be succinct, but in reality, particularly if you're defending yourself, you will be allowed to take your time if you want to do so. You can even ask for a break if you need to do that. So you can kind of guide them through things, and that actually can land very well in a way that, and don't get me wrong, I completely understand if what you want to do is stand up and rant. Totally get it. But from the judge's point of view, they will be far more on side if the way you're presenting is centered and collected. And don't worry if you do get emotional. It doesn't mean don't express it. But yelling at the system in the court is not the best context. The yelling at the system can happen at the action, if that's what needs to happen. But yeah, so there is something about how this is presented in a sort of coherent and familiar way to them, so that you're using a language that they understand. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add before we perhaps get in touch with Polly and find out if there are more questions anyone wants to put?
Yeah, I've got just four very quick points.
Yeah.
I think the first thing, really important, if you are charged, it is a good idea to get some independent legal advice. I mean, that isn't what this is about today. Getting independent legal advice doesn't mean you don't end up self-representing. You can get some advice about your different options and then choose to represent yourself in court. It's still good to hear from a lawyer who advises you on your particular charge, what the implications of that are. And then I'd just like to mention 3 ways things can go wrong and 3 ways you can preempt those problems. There's lots of documentation that can support you, lots of work that's been done that can support you through the trial process. Imagine you're in court, you're referring now to various reports on climate change. The prosecutor says, now tell us, when did you first read these documents? And you say, aha, well, XR helped me, or Mission LifeForce helped me. So you hadn't read them before you did what you did. Well, how does that explain what was in your mind at the time? And you can see that that then gets a little bit difficult. What we want is an important part of this process is for you to read some basic documentation before you take action. And you're then able to say to the court, actually, I'd read this beforehand. So yes, I did know about this. I did know the government's own independent scientific advisor, Sir David King, has said what the government's doing is crazy. It knows what needs to be done and it's not doing it, etc., etc. Police interviews can go wrong, particularly if you're on your own. You've got another potential defence that we haven't talked about here, which is the prosecution, the police have screwed up. They haven't actually got the evidence to show you were the person who did the graffiti or whatever it is. They think it's you, but they haven't actually got a witness to that. That's why you don't ever really want to say, yes, this is what I did, until you've seen exactly what they've got. You don't want to make life easy for them. You're innocent until proven guilty. But if you make a no-comment interview, what might be said later on is, well, hang on, you're telling us this is about freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, and when we asked you about this, you said nothing. Well, we thought you wanted to tell us about your beliefs. And so an approach that's often recommended is that you read a prepared statement to the police. And that way, you're not tricked into saying something that helps them out, that just slips out under pressure, and you're putting your case, squarely before them. And we've got a version of a prepared statement that you might use, you don't have to, that sets out quite a lot of the evidence. It's long, it's longer than usual. That puts the police in a difficult position. If they cut you off and say, right, enough, we don't want to hear any more of this, well, that doesn't make them look very good. So that's part of the strategy. And then the last point I wanted to make is there are these various technical defences: necessity, duress of circumstance, self-defence. If you're self-representing, it might be quite clever actually not to be too technical. Because the minute you mention a defence, the court can say, well, we don't think that's going to be a good defence, that doesn't work, so no, we don't want to hear about that. If you say, well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not here to tell you what the defence is, I'm just going to tell you why I did what I did. And I'm pretty sure that if you hear me, if you understand what I'm saying to you, you will realise I'm not a criminal. I'm actually just trying to protect all of us. And then it's very hard to shut you down because they don't know what your defence is until they've heard you. So those are just a few tips. And please don't anybody think you're getting just too much information at the moment. It is all going to be there. It's all going to be written down. Take this in stages. But do be prepared in advance and read. Get yourself well informed before you take action, if possible.
And I would add to that if you have signed up to the Protectors Trust Fund before you take action, you have a very concrete way of proving that you were acting from conscience. And I like Tim's, I like that attitude of if they can't shut you down on a particular thing because you're just speaking your truth. We actually know from members of the judiciary that is actually the most powerful thing is somebody really standing in their own truth and not letting themselves get caught out by technical questions for the prosecution. You can always feel free to say exactly as I'm not an expert. I just know why I needed to take action, and I've given you my reasons, and here's and here's my information. Because it's easy to get thrown by somebody asking you a question and you sort of think, oh, I ought to know something about that, but I don't know that it's okay. You don't have to be the expert here. That's why you've got that information to offer them. So yeah, absolutely. I actually had a little one for Tim. When we were arrested, we had everything taken off us, and so I didn't have anything. I kind of wanted to do something like what you were talking about. I wanted to give a statement in that I ended up just being very careful what I said so that I knew I could use it. But I didn't actually have anything with me that I was able to then read to them in the interview because they'd taken everything off of me.
I'm amazed that they're able to do. I mean, I know that they do take your possessions when you're charged, but if you say, I've got it all written down, and that's what I want to say, and there it is. I mean, if they stop you doing that...
Yeah, no, got it.
And you could also have it online as well, and say, well, fine, you've got a phone.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing, of course, with signing up to the trust fund, is your name is on the website as a signatory. So you can actually just refer them to that. So look, there I am. I've signed that. You can see my name on there. You can just search it. There it is. Right. Yeah.
Jojo, I mentioned earlier the standstill case. And,
for people who don't know, that's about people
who stopped a plane from being taking off.
On it going away. Now, I understand the judge allowed the people who were charged to raise issues under the Human Rights Act, but then I think told the jury that they had to disregard all that. I know the case is being appealed. That seems wrong in law to me. I mean, it seems a very odd thing to do. I'd be interested in that. But the second question is sort of more personal, but may affect other people here. I was arrested in November, haven't been charged yet, may not be charged, I don't know. I will not be eligible for legal aid if I am charged. I'm worried about costs. If Tim or you could say something about that, that would be helpful.
I could say something, and Tim may also have an opinion on this, I don't know. What people have done in the past is actually create little crowd funds, small-scale crowd funds online. There's an outfit called Crowd Justice, which specialises in these particular, in funding, in crowdfunding for legal cases. Of course, it's not guaranteed, but in all the cases where we've seen it done, a handful of cases have used that particular method, and they've all covered their costs very quickly in their own communities. It may, obviously, it may depend a bit on your community, but on the whole, there's quite a strong support for this sort of thing online. I've noticed when I've seen these sort of legal crowd funds, they're often very well supported. So that would be our sort of first recommendation in terms of an avenue to go down. It also brings up another point about people's sort of, what kind of risk you're taking in terms of going to the court. Obviously, what we do know from our own experience with the conscientious protectors, people have been given literally kind of £20 fines. Literally nothing. Don't forget, the criminal court's very different to the civil court. In the civil courts, you can be given huge costs. In criminal court, they can't do that. It has to be proportional to what you can afford and to your income. And in the conscientious protector cases that we know of, it's always been very low, almost like the minimum that they can get away with. It's like they may be saying, I legally don't feel I can acquit you. They're not saying this in these words, But I legally don't feel I can acquit you, but, I understand what you're saying, and you're going to get the minimum. So there's that. But it's not a guarantee. Of course, it's not a guarantee. But yeah, there is this big difference between the civil and criminal courts in that respect.
What is solicitors' cost or the expert witness cost?
Well, that's what I was going to come to. Legal aid is relevant to the costs of your own solicitors. So if you don't qualify for legal aid, it doesn't mean you have to self-represent. I think we've had, Jojo, we were talking about this the other day, there have been quite a few senior counsel who've been offering to help.
Yeah.
And I think there are various lawyers who are going to be able to, or will be willing and interested to support people pro bono where there isn't legal aid. Mm-hmm. And so we're starting to build up, a bit of a list of some pretty impressive lawyers, and I think so.
I'm interested in the prosecution costs, really.
That's not going to be a huge amount. Yeah.
What do you mean by not huge amount?
So, as Jojo says, in civil proceedings, people are terrified about costs because they can be tens and tens of thousands of pounds. If the prosecution asks for costs, I don't want to put a figure on it because it's been a while since I've been there. It's one of these things we ought to know. But it's more likely to be a few £100 is the sort of thing.
Yeah. Up to the high rate, a maximum of £1,000. Most of the fracking cases have never gone above £300.
There we are. That's
a useful bit of information from now there. Thank you.
And the standstill stuff?
I have to say, I don't know a lot of in-depth information about that case. I don't know if you have anything you can inform us on that.
So, yeah, you're right. Basically, the judge said to the jury, you cannot acquit these people on the basis of necessity. They were running the defence of necessity. I'd say it was a harsh judgment. I also think there's a big difference between people who are taking, I mean, these are people blocking deportations, saying if these people are deported, they're going to get tortured. There's a difference between something that raises very complex political questions, as in the actions taken by people protesting against the Iraq war. What we've got here is we can say this isn't really political, this is science. This is what the science says has to happen. It's not happening. And I think there is a distinction that can be drawn there.
Sorry, I don't want to... Can they actually say to the jury, you can't take this stuff into account?
A judge can, as we saw here, a judge advises the jury on the law.
But isn't that an error of law?
It's being suggested that it was.
Okay.
I mean, but I mean, in principle, a judge can say they haven't done enough to make good on the defence. If you look at the case law, they haven't ticked all the boxes here.
The thing is, environmental protection is incredibly political. So that's the thing, is how do you make your argument unpolitical when in actual fact all of the responses that we need to have towards environmental protection, towards divesting from fossil fuels, are all inherently very political. So they are all very tied to certain strategic positions that countries take towards other countries, certain vested interests that we have in maintaining certain ties with ecologically harmful corporations, and also, I mean, that's in all aspects of environmental degradation, whether it's agriculturally, whether it's in fossil fuels, etc. And they are all, I think it's almost sort of naive of us to sort of say, oh well, we're only doing something that's not political, because in actual fact, all of modernity is incredibly political and very dependent on fossil fuels and on environmental degradation. So how do we go around that?
I think it's a good question.
I'll take that one as well.
I mean, nobody's saying this isn't political. Of course, it's deeply and intensely political. But there's a big difference between an argument that says our political system is toxic and completely screwed and we need something completely different, which is never going to work as a defence in court, and being in a position where we can now say every serious scientist says, we are heading towards the cliff edge and we have to stop now, because that bit of it is no longer a political statement. That bit of it is a technical statement, and that puts us in a stronger position in court.
I would just add to that there's a really noticeable lack of discussion of criminal law around climate breakdown and actually environmental damage in every way. I mean, we really notice it because that's what we're dealing with. And actually, once something becomes a criminal issue, it does change that whole landscape you're talking about. I mean, nobody says that murder's political, murder's a crime. Yeah? So genocide is a crime. Yeah, of course there's going to be politics there. There may well be politics involved in a given case or whatever. But effectively, once you make something a crime, it's going into a different territory, and it actually starts steering policy as opposed to responding to it, if you see what I mean. So I think that there was, there's lots of hands. I'm just wondering whether people would like me to call Polly to say hi.
How is defence of climate change used when you're occupying 5 bridges in central London?
I actually think that one of the most important things is to highlight the imminency of the risk of climate breakdown. And to do that, we're dealing with a unique situation. Usually when you're dealing with imminency in law, it's, how close are you to the guy who's about to detonate a bomb, and therefore you intervene. But actually, the bomb that's being detonated here, if you look at a wider context, the evolution of humanity, it's immediate. And so it's actually giving it context and relying on, backing that up with primary evidence that substantiates that. So the IPCC report that came out last year is saying rapid reductions have to be made imminently. And we only have 12 years to put this right. That doesn't mean we leave it for 12 years. It means we have to start now so that we can actually get to some form of stability within the next 12 years. So it's all to do with taking people on a bit of a journey, really, to understand that imminency is to be looked at. We're dealing with global context, and it transcends time and space in the normal way a small crime would do in the normal circumstances. You know, someone's about to steal an apple, for instance. You're dealing with something that has far more serious consequences, not just for humanity, but for the Earth. And so it's giving it that wider framing. I think it's a framing issue, actually. Once you take people on expanding their vision of what this is about, then you're basically giving an expansive response to what is happening. And this is all to do with also how representations are made in court, to take a judge, a jury, whoever's in the courtroom on that journey so that they can start seeing the issues within a wider context.
Okay, got a question here in the front.
Well, I was just thinking, it's a bit like lighting a fuse, a long fuse to the bomb. It's like, if you light the fuse, it's going to go off, but it's not going to go off straight away because it's a long fuse.
Yeah, but also it's to actually say the fuse has already been lit, and actually this is stoppable. That's the whole point. We can prevent this from happening. It's preventable because it hasn't completely gotten to the bomb yet. We've got to stop that fuse from complete detonation. Yeah.
Okay. The lady in the green scarf and then the chap at the back.
So I like the fuse analogy, but the problem is the fuse was lit a very long time ago with our colonial policies, with all of our production means. How can we sort of face, I mean, also sort of conscientiously objecting, all right, but then can't you also be faced with a court who sort of says, right, and so how is blocking the bridge helping? When in actual fact what needs to be done is an entirely total change of structure. And so how do you frame that in a way where you're not just completely proposing total reorganization of society, which will be limiting in a lot of ways, and I think that's the thing as well, is it's sort of saying, oh, there's just some corporations who are doing this. The corporations function in order to provide certain demands, and those are public demands. So technologically, food-wise, transport-wise, those are public demands.
Yeah, but also, you know, this is something that actually Tim really touches on in a really big way with all of his work, is the failure of the responsibility to protect. Now, there is actually an international global commitment that's been signed off by governments back in 2005 called the Responsibility to Protect. And it's kind of the soft law document that runs in tandem with international crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on and so forth. What Ecocide is doing is expanding that responsibility to protect. It's not just about protecting against crimes against humanity, but it's protecting against ecocide and climate ecocide for that matter. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're dealing with serious harm. You know, it doesn't matter if that company is managing to feed millions, what have you. If it's causing serious harm along the way, then that isn't a good solution. And it's actually, once you start seeing it within that context, you can ask one simple question about any business, any government decision, any local council decision, and even a decision within your own lifetime. Is this going to cause serious harm? And that's when you start to look deeper into, the kind of the background of what's happening. I mean, you could say that fossil fuel companies are providing us with the ability to move around the world, fly, drive, what have you, which is absolutely fantastic. And indeed, we wouldn't have had the progress that we have without fossil fuel. But then there's evidence to show that 100 companies are causing over 70% of all carbon emissions. And if you're looking at, under the IPCC report, a world that is on a trajectory to 4 degrees, and we have to get it under 2 degrees, then if you're going to cut over 70%, it's got to be that those companies have to be shut down. That has to be criminalised because it's causing serious harm. So it's about, in a way, keeping it simple. Asking the question, whose interests are being protected here? Is it the polluter or the planet? Is this causing serious harm or is it not? And that's something that, a child can get actually.
Can I just come in as well? Because I agree completely. It is complete societal transformation we need. That is a huge thing. It isn't going to happen just by individuals doing more recycling, flying a bit less. But the first thing that has to happen to give us a chance is for governments to be honest and to say, this is the crisis we're in. We're going to tell you because we know it's true. There's been a lot of confusion about this. And somehow together, we've got to find a way out of it. And they're not doing that. They're being dishonest. They know the truth. And when you block those bridges, what you're doing is you're reflecting this breach of the basic social contract, that basic obligation of the government to protect its people. And you're drawing attention to that failure. There's a brilliant James Baldwin quote from the civil rights era, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that is what I think we're trying to do when we block those bridges. We're saying, face up to this, because that's the start of getting out of the position we're in.
Yeah, and this is, Tim, you've got it in a nutshell anyway, because this is also about state accountability. And that comes back to that failure in their responsibility to protect and the complicity between state and corporations, the dangerous industrial activity that has corporate immunity and is acting with impunity. So it's going to the centre of power and challenging that. And that's absolutely vital.
Okay. There's a chap at the back, and then let's come to you.
It's kind of in line with the case we were talking about, where the judge said they couldn't. He actually told them they weren't allowed to pay attention to that part of the evidence. There's a book that's on one of your resources, Represent Yourself in Court, and I hadn't heard of it or seen it before, but it said if you represent yourself, and I don't know if it's something that they can ask for, but if you represent yourself, you can ask for perverse acquittal, which basically is saying, yeah, I'm guilty, but I want the jury to find me not guilty anyway. So I did break the law. But it says like a perverse acquittal, so even the judge was saying by the terms of the law you are guilty, but you're trying to convince the jury.
Had you come across that term before, perverse acquittal?
Well, yes, and it's also known as, in Canada, as the conscience verdict. So it's all about the right to freedom of conscience. In fact, there was a very famous case in Canada around this in 2006. I completely forget what the name of it is. But it was a case about taking action because there was a failure to protect. And so Jeffrey Robertson's actually written about it. He's written a book called The Justice Game. So it's coming back to that point, you're not a criminal, you are a conscientious protector.
Okay. What was the name of that book, sorry? The Justice Game. The Justice Game. Yeah. Is that Jeffrey Robertson?
Jeffrey Robertson, The Justice Game. And, it's really interesting because, in fact, I've just Googled it. I've just literally sat here and Googled it quickly to pull it up. And I'll read to you what it says here. This is a little update. It's Canadian. So weirdly, there's actually a judge in Canada called Lord Judge. And he referred to perverse verdicts as constitutional safeguards against barbaric laws. So this is really interesting. We don't actually have a constitution, but it's this idea that as someone with conscience, you're standing up and you're speaking up against whatever it is that's wrong, and whether or not it's something that's been criminalised or allowed to be lawful, shouldn't be lawful, so one way or the other. So it's this idea that actually perverse verdicts are, in a way, if you like, or conscience verdicts, they act as a check and a balance because you're bringing to the attention of the legal system, the political system, to say this is wrong.
Okay, we're running over now, so I'm just going to take, I think there are just 2 more questions. The lady here in the glasses and the chap on the other row. Yeah.
I was just going to ask very quickly about developing an argument where you could say that the government is not currently enacting its own legislation in terms of the Climate Change Act, and what you would call that, because it doesn't seem like it's failure to protect, and would you recommend that as a way of proceeding?
Yeah, most definitely, absolutely. It's a very good example of the failure to protect. Yeah, of the responsibility to protect, without a doubt.
And then we've got one last question.
Yeah, so climate change, ecological collapse, etc. are obviously bound to get exponentially worse with time and also geographically. So for some people in small island nations, etc., shallow nations, Bangladesh, and as time goes on, we're seeing increasing risks of extreme weather events and probably wars, which are going to kill lots of people or displace them, etc. For people in those kind of situations, so particularly younger people and people who come from those nations or those locations, who are going to be more likely to be victims, what do you think of proposing the possibility of self-defense as a reasoning for defense, essentially?
So let me get this right. You're saying that, say, we have someone from Vanuatu who's arrested on Westminster Bridge for blocking the highway, whether or not she can run any of the self-defense routes. Actually, you don't have to be from the Pacific to do that, or from a frontline country to do that. So anyone can do it if they're standing up and protesting to bring forward Extinction Rebellion issues, conscientious protector approach, what have you. I don't know whether or not. I mean, when you're looking at self-defense, in a way, what you're actually arguing is necessity. Actually, I think that's really more what you're looking at here is the defence of necessity. The act was done in order to actually highlight the fact that we have to avoid consequences which cannot otherwise be avoided. And that's really what that comes down to. Getting yourself arrested in London for something that's happening on the other side of the world, you're actually running the same arguments and the same defences, I think. I don't see how that would necessarily differ.
Okay. Did you want to
just very quickly, I mean, I think it is self-defence. I don't mean legally, I just mean really.
Yes.
Because by the time you wait for the shit to
I
really
get that.
happen,
Morally,
it's too
yes.
late.
Morally, yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a way, you're actually all arguing self-defence morally as well.
Well, exactly. But I think this comes a little bit to that point about you don't need to do this whether you're here or whether you're in Tuvalu. You don't need to say to the court, my defence is self-defence. You just need to explain, I've got a right to take actions, to safeguard my future, your future, everybody's future. And then it's for the court, in some ways, to worry about technically what that means. But it's a powerful argument.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, I think we've actually slightly overrun, so we're probably going to have to wind up now. Have you got anything else you'd like to say to the audience, Polly?
Actually, I just wanted to go back to that lady's point she made earlier about relying on the UK's Climate Act, which is a very good example. You have to substantiate any assertion you make. You're going to have to substantiate it with, evidence, and so you have to be in a position to be able to say why the Climate Act is not being upheld and in what way. I mean, in a way, you're kind of actually paving the ground for civil litigation there, funnily enough. But everything, assertions are not enough because a court can just reject them. It's actually relying on the primary evidence. drawing the attention of the court to that primary evidence, saying, okay, I'm going to take you to this. This is the analysis. It's not just me saying this as a random punter. Here we have a peer-reviewed document by a bunch of academics or what have you, and I'm going to take you to page 39 of that, which I've printed out for you, the particular page. Now, if I take you to paragraph 3, what they're saying here is, therefore, our conclusion is that the Climate Act is not being upheld, or something like that. Back up everything that you say so that you actually leave the court in a position of saying, well, we have to accept this. And that's what's really important here. If you can back up and substantiate your position, it comes across that much far stronger than just bare assertions. Also, what you do is you close the door to the prosecution trying to make mincemeat out of you.
And so could the government then be think about something about civil litigation in terms of, could that be pushed?
Well, that's what we're doing. Yeah.
This is absolutely Tim's arena. I mean, they're really on that case. I mean, there is again this slight different. If I've understood correctly, Polly, am I right? That there's a difference with criminal. In a criminal court, is very much comes down to the primary evidence that you can produce, because it's seriously evidence based. So, which is presumably also why you were advising those activists that we spoke to yesterday that actually it's not going to hurt at your plea hearing to say, to list a whole number of defences you think you might be using.
Yes, exactly right.
Because even in the end, which is a point Tim made, when it comes to you, when you as a sort of as a conscientious protector and not a legal expert, if what you come out with in the actual trial doesn't absolutely fall into a specific technical defence, so long as you've got your primary documents to back up what you're saying, that's kind of the key thing, and that they can't then say to you, well, you never said you were going to argue that defence.
Exactly right. I mean, in a way, what you're doing is you're covering your own back, moving forward as well, and going in there with all your ducks lined up. Worst case scenario, well, duress isn't made out. Worst case scenario, well, judge doesn't accept necessity. But in defence of others, that's actually what that particular judge on that particular day or jury on that particular day really do say, you know what, this is really important, I get this. And, this is the thing also with conscience verdicts, like in Canada. If you're in front of a jury, you're far more likely to have a really good run at it. And if you're a litigant in person, the court has to give you so much more time anyway. So you actually then have a golden opportunity, you have an advantage there to really present the evidence you want to present and take everyone on that journey to understand why it is that you're taking the action that you're doing. And remember this, your average criminal court is dealing with a diet of individuals who have a background in robbery, in domestic violence. So suddenly they get an individual stepping into the dock who's actually doing it for a greater purpose. And if you do have a judge with conscience, they will want to hear your arguments. They will want to hear what you have to say about this. I mean, we do know that there's a spectrum of judges out there. You can kind of go from the Cruella de Vil end to, one that is really engaging in it. And it was the same for the conscientious objectors. But it's really about standing your ground and making sure that you're heard and doing it, reasonably and well-informedly. Yeah. And that's powerful.
Okay, I think that's probably all we've got time for. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and we hope your back is improving.
Yeah.
I hope you're doing absolutely nothing.
I've been sleeping. Yeah, I'm genuinely really sorry not to be there. I was really actually looking forward to it. But I'm so grateful, Tim. Thank you very much for stepping in.
Thanks. It's been great to be here, Polly. I hope you feel better soon.
Yeah, me too.
Give her a get well soon, everyone. Get well soon. All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for doing the brave things that you are doing or intending to do. Both. And make sure...